doesn't come on you just because it kind of ought to, because you did it.
Can you, since you have so much experience in this field over decades, can you compare for us, especially those of us who didn't live through it, what this period we're going through now is like as compared to the 1970s, when the last time inflation really began to dominate the economic discussion? What are some of the differences? What are some of the similarities? And how do we understand our current situation with its historic analogs?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. Yes, we had a terrible inflation. By the way, the inflation in those days was caused, people might be interested, mostly by the war in Vietnam. And here's what I mean. That was a long and difficult war, lasting, as many of you know, from the latter part of the 1960s into the early 70s. And that war presented enormous costs. Vietnam is 10,000 miles away. So if you're going to fight a war over there, which is what we did, you have to move all your equipment, all your soldiers, all your support, 10,000 miles back. And it's an immense supply chain problem, very, very expensive. And the presidents at that time, starting with Kennedy and then Johnson and so on, and Nixon, the presidents knew that the war was not popular in the United States. And it would become a lot less popular. And it wasn't very popular to begin with, but it would become a lot less popular if you went to the American people and you said, not only are we sending our young men and women 10,000 miles away to a country you couldn't even find on a map, and we're a very large country, and Vietnam is a very poor little country, but you're going to have to pay for it. It's going to cost you $5,000 a year in extra taxes to raise the money to fund the war. They knew that with that, the war would be over because in the streets would be all the taxpayers, not just the young people protesting who didn't want to get drafted. So it was decided to pay for the war not by taxing people, but by borrowing. See, it turns out rich people are very willing to lend to the government instead of paying taxes. That's a no brainer. If you pay taxes, the money's gone, the government takes it and does what it will. If the government borrows, they give you back the money after a few years, plus they give you interest each year while you wait to get the money paid back. If you're choosing between lending to the government and being taxed by the government, the rich people always know which way to go. So the rich people lent the money, the government turned that into the basis for printing more money, and we had a flood of money, and we didn't increase output because we were fighting a war. So you had that classic story, too much money chasing too few goods, and the inflation went crazy. All right. Now we get to the point where it becomes the kind of story it is today. Everybody's worried about it. Businesses are screaming. Working people are screaming. The president happens to be a conservative Republican, Richard Nixon. So he goes on television and radio on the 15th of August. If anyone wants to pursue it, I'm sure you can find newsreel footage. Um, he goes on radio and television and he makes an amazing speech. He says, everybody hates the inflation, and they're right. And I'm the president, and I'm going to stop it because that's what everyone wants me to do, and I'll do it. Here's what we're going to do, announces a conservative Republican. As of tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, any enterprise, any employer who raises the price of whatever it is he or she sells, here's what I want you to know. We will come for you, we will arrest you, and we'll throw you in jail. He let that sink in. 30 seconds later, he says, if you're a worker or a union and you do that to press up your wages, the same will happen to you. In other words, I'm declaring, and this was the name of the policy, a price wage freeze. It's going to last for the next 90 days, and that's how we're going to stop inflation. So here's what happened. The inflation stopped on a dime. I want everyone to understand this policy worked. It was a conservative president who imposed it. It worked so well, it was extended several more months beyond the original 90 days. Did this policy have problems? Yes. Any policy dealing with inflation has its problems. For example, the current plan of this government, supported by the Republicans, is to raise interest rates by the Federal Reserve. That's going to have problems. Everyone with a credit card is going to be paying more this month than they did last month, even if they didn't use the credit card more, because the interest rate on your outstanding balance has been raised, and that's going to cost you more money. So it has its problems. Here's the remarkable thing, though, for your listeners and for the people of Counterpunch. We're not discussing the options of how to deal with inflation. We have a government, Democrats and Republicans, because on these kinds of issues, I have no sense of a difference between them. Mr. Biden reappointed Mr. Powell. Mr. Powell is the head of the Federal Reserve. And Mr. Biden has said he's leaving it to Mr. Powell. Okay, I mean, what do we have new parties for? You are the same guys. You're going to raise interest rates. And you're acting as if that's the only policy in the world. It isn't. It never was. Inflations have been a problem for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We have a long history of alternative ways. Some work better, some work not so well. There ought to be a discussion because, by the way, there are more options, not just a price wage freeze versus interest rates. There are others, an honest government that even pretended to be democratic would lay these options in front of people so we could have a national discussion and then reach some sort of democratic decision which of these different policies we want to use or what mixture of. None of that is happening. If you wanted an example of a government disconnected from the mass of its people, nothing would be clearer than watching the absurd debate among Republicans and Democrats, which only circulate about how much we raise the interest rates, how soon we raise the interest rates, and what series of steps do we raise, as if that were the only thing. It's like I'm saying to you, we're going to have a conversation with you about dinner. All right? You can have one hot dog, or you can have one and a half hot dogs, or you can have I might heat the hot dog a little more. After a while, you'd stop me and say, "That's it, Grandma? Only hot dogs? That's all there is?" And Grandma would then have to face the reality that she's cut you out of all the other options in the world that you could have for dinner because, for whatever reason, she wants that one. And I'll give you now the reason. Raising interest rates does not interfere directly in any business, and that's what our government is for, serving business. So does it hurt you with your credit card? You bet. Does it mean that buying a used or new car will cost you more monthly payments with a higher interest rate? You bet. Does it mean it prices you out of buying your own home? You bet. Does it mean for students even more payments to get their college degree? You bet. So are there victims of it? You bet. Are there alternatives to it? You bet. But we have a society that refuses to honestly deal with its people. It is misgovernment on a scale that I must tell you is really causes economists of many different persuasions to shake their heads in disgust.
Let's go a little bit deeper on that issue because one of the interesting tensions seems to be in both in discussing this and just generally seems to be between, well, which is worse for workers? On the one hand, you have inflation, which I think is obviously a problem for any working class person. On the other hand, if you want to address inflation by hiking the interest rates, you're hurting, as you said, prospective home buyers. What about workers in general? What does this do to unemployment? They keep trumpeting these great unemployment numbers. We've gotten unemployment down. We've gotten unemployment down. All of a sudden, now you hike the interest rate. What happens to the workers?
Well, everybody who's ever studied this knows, and I could give you endless quotes from right wing, left wing, it doesn't really matter. If you raise interest rates a lot, which in a sense we already have, and quickly, which in a sense we already have, with more coming. There's another one scheduled in July, which is what, 3 days from now, we begin the month of July. Uh, the reality is that you are going to have unemployment because higher interest rate. Look, let me tell you just how bad it is. Starting in the year 2000, we've had a series of crashes of our capitalist system. We don't give it much attention, but we ought to. In the spring of 2000, we had the so-called dot-com crash, right? In the autumn of 2008 and into 2009, we had what has come to be called the Great Recession, or sometimes the subprime mortgage crash. And now in 2020, we had the COVID crash. Well, it's very nice to give each crash its own name as if they were different, but it's a collapse of the same capitalist system over and over again. So, what the federal government did, it was terrified that a collapse of the stock market, which happened in each of those three, would overflow the stock market and become a Great Depression like we had in the 1930s. Let's remember 1933, the unemployment rate in the United States, 25%, which meant every single family in the country had somebody unemployed who therefore had to be taken care of by the rest of the family because we didn't have unemployment compensation until well into the Depression. Okay. Over the last 20 years, what the government did to try to prevent these crashes from becoming depressions was to